Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk on women and the early Gothic. So by early Gothic, I'm speaking from about the 1760s to the 1820s. And we're going to be looking at the role that women played in the early Gothic in a number of different ways. So we'll be looking at women as theorists of the Gothic, the ways in which women were pivotal in developing the Gothic, in popularising the Gothic as well. We'll be looking at various examples of women writing in the Gothic, so moving away from the idea that women were all writing the same type of thing. We'll also be looking at women's role in publishing the Gothic and also in selling the Gothic. And finally, rounding up by thinking about women reading the Gothic in this period. So as you can see, there's quite a lot to get through. I'll be looking at a small number of examples for each of these topics, but it's not exhaustive. So first of all, theorising the Gothic. Now, the Gothic, right from its inception, always had critics. First, for the sort of unsuitable nature of the subject matter. And as the genre develops, there's critiques of it for its genericism, for its repetition, for being really formulaic, for being extreme, for being immoral, for being a bad influence on the young, on the poor, on women particularly. But you've also got defenses of the Gothic throughout this period, either through the defense of a specific work, for example, or through theorizing the foundations of the Gothic, giving value to the Gothic through the theorization of, for example, terror, the appeal of terror, its connection to the sublime, and also through works that distinguish between good and bad terror, giving a value to at least certain forms of the Gothic. So I want to think about three female theorists here, going from the 1770s up into the 19th century. So we're going to have a quick look at Anna Letitia Barbauld, nee Aitken, and I'll be referring to her as Aitken in this section, Anne Radcliffe, of course, and one that you might not know, Mary Schimmelpenninck. So Anna Letitia Aitken, later Barbauld, with her brother John, wrote a couple of essays which explored the Gothic in different ways. The main one is on the pleasure derived from objects of terror. The other one, which is related, is an inquiry into those kinds of distresses which excite agreeable sensations, not directly written about the Gothic or terror literature, but very applicable. And these were published in 1773. And basically, they're explorations of literary aesthetics. In the essay on the pleasure derived from objects of terror, Barbauld is investigating what makes terror interesting, but also what makes terror valuable. What she summarizes as the appeal of terror in the end is basically curiosity. She's saying we're not just kind of wanting to see horrible things. We read terror literature because we're drawn in. There's the pain of suspense and then this irresistible desire of satisfying curiosity. So the effect of reading isn't necessarily a pure pleasure, but there is a delight in fulfilling the uneasy craving of an unsatisfied desire. And she doesn't view this universally positively, indeed, saying that some are perhaps chained by the ears and fascinated by curiosity and kind of unwilling addiction to the Gothic and the ghostly. But she does also see an important value in terror. And she differentiates between sort of good and bad terror to some extent and focuses on the possibilities of the supernatural related to terror to produce its sublime experience and to open the mind. So she says that the more wild, fanciful, and extraordinary are the circumstances, the more pleasure we receive. And she explores what the effect of an encounter with these circumstances is in literature, saying that a strange and unexpected event awakens the mind, keeps it on the stretch, and where the agency of invisible beings is introduced, of forms unseen and mightier far than we, our imagination darting forth explores with rapture the new world laid open to its view, and rejoices in the expansion of its powers. Passion and fancy cooperating elevate the soul to its highest pitch, and the pain of terror is lost in amazement. So she is valorizing the use of the supernatural in literature here, as well as terror, an important building block for a defense of the Gothic. A lot of the essay that she's writing alongside John is this exploration of techniques as well, and what leads to a successful sort of form of the supernatural, particularly thinking about suspense and about the use of invisible possibilities. She also makes some comments in the other essay on the kinds of distresses which excite agreeable sensations, makes some sort of commentary on what doesn't work. And she particularly warns against excess, on heaping together all the afflicting events and dismal accidents your imagination can furnish, and sort of breaking their heart of the reader and then expecting them to thank you for it. So a little bit of a dig, one might suggest, in her work at the kind of novel where they just want you to cry all the time, or the kind of excess you find in something like The Castle of Otranto, the first Gothic novel. It's not just a piece of theory either that we find in the Aitken's work or Barbauld's work. She also illuminates this with a fragment. So a fragment of a story called Sir Bertrand, which explores these different types of terror and how they can be combined or how they can be written to open and awake the mind. Anne Radcliffe is probably the most famous of the theorists of terror from this period. And to some extent, she disagrees with Anna Letitia Barbauld. She, for example, isn't particularly influenced by or emphasizing the supernatural as the key mode of producing sublime terror, although she is investigating the use of the supernatural in her essay on the supernatural in poetry, something which is quite often forgotten by critics who associate Anne Radcliffe exclusively with the supernatural explained. In other ways, though, she is very much in a sort of tradition that Aitken is also in, thinking about the value of terror and also differentiating between good and bad terror. You can see both of these critics, I would argue, as critically engaging with that famous work by Edmund Burke on the sublime, where he says that all terror is sublime. And both of these female writers are pushing back against that. Now, Radcliffe famously differentiates between terror and horror, and I've done a whole talk on this if you're interested, which looks at the history of this debate. But she basically valorizes terror at the expense of horror and associates terror with uncertainty, using her mouthpiece in this conversational essay W to say that men must have very cold imaginations with whom certainty is more terrible than surmise. And then goes on to differentiate terror and horror as so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life, and the other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them. She also then goes on to think about different literary examples. So this is a piece of literary criticism. And she looks to the key examples of the terror sublime, people like Shakespeare and Milton and Burke, and saying that they weren't actually looking at positive horror as a source of the sublime, though they all agree that terror is a very high one. And where lies the great difference between horror and terror? But in the uncertainty and obscurity that accompany the first, or for the latter, respecting the dreaded evil. So she also gives us a lot of exploration of the techniques of terror, something else that we don't often talk about when talking about Radcliffe. She compares the ghosts in Hamlet and Banquo's ghost in Macbeth, suggesting that Hamlet's ghost is much more effective because of the dramatic and literary techniques associated with his appearance. We might disagree. I personally disagree, but this is an interesting theorization of what is needed to create a valuable terror. The last theorist I want to introduce is Mary Ann Schimmelpenninck, whose book is available on Google Books, so you can go and look at this table that I'm using to illustrate my points in detail, because there's a lot of little tiny details on it that are going to be difficult to see. In 1815, she writes a theory on the classification of beauty and deformity and their correspondence with physiognomic expression, exemplified in various works of art and natural objects. So that's a snappy title. But what she does is to explore that relationship between the sublime and terror, but also to explore the sublime and its usage as not just related to terror. So again, part of that tradition we're already finding in Aitken and in Radcliffe of differentiating between the terrors that do and do not create the sublime. So you can't really see her tables here, but I've given a little bit of a close-up to a part of them. She talks about the beauties in the first table, so on the left, the beauties, aesthetic beauties, and she talks about the sublime, the active sublime, or what she calls the terrible sublime. So linking terror and the sublime together. But she also produces another form of the sublime, the contemplative sublime. So she's giving the sublime kind of more breadth than somebody like Burke does, but she's very much in an existing tradition in doing that. But she's also kind of refusing the gender distinction that somebody like Burke makes between a sort of masculine sublime and a feminine beautiful. By creating these different categories, she allows for a much broader approach to the sublime, seeing it in lots of different works and characters. She also investigates what she calls deformity, so a fairly ableist framing here, but that when the terror sublime becomes something else, when it's almost no longer sublime, when it becomes for her horrible, and the contemplative sublime becomes vapid. So, for example, force in the active or terrible sublime becomes distorted and becomes violence in the horrible, which she is valuing less than the terrible. Another interesting thing about her comparisons is that she very directly engages with literary theory and indeed the work of other women by producing examples of the active and terrible sublime and the horrible from different literary works. And we'll come back to that later with an example from one of our women writers in one of the later sections. So do keep that in mind. So we've thought about women theorizing the Gothic. Let's have a look at their role in developing the Gothic. Now, everybody's aware that the first Gothic novel, or at least the first novel that calls itself Gothic, is Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. But it's women that really shape the direction in which the Gothic goes after this point. So there are a couple of other writers that produce kind of quasi-Gothic works in this period, or Gothic works. So The Hermitage by William Hutchinson, for example, or Vathek by William Beckford, an example of the Oriental Gothic. But a really key book in this progress of the Gothic, which paves the way for the popularity of the Gothic, is Clara Reeve's The Old English Baron, in which she deliberately sets out to amend Otranto, something that she mentions in her preface. So she published in 1777 a book called The Champion of Virtue, which had a limited publication, and then she republishes it, wider publication with some emendations, as The Old English Baron in 1778. And she directly engages with the Castle of Otranto in her preface, saying that she's directly responding to it, partly by trying to take up the same project, i.e. combining the marvelous and the realistic in her work. And she also uses a lot of the same plot points. So this is a story of a usurpation of a castle, of murder and betrayal, and also of a lost heir who's sort of disguised in the neighborhood as a peasant. So a lot of similarities with Walpole, but also a lot of key differences. And what she does with her novel is she uses it to illustrate the critiques of Otranto that she makes in her preface. So it's a sort of corrective text. And one of the key things she criticizes in Walpole is his redundancy in the marvelous, i.e., he just uses too much supernatural and it's too over the top. So she offers or presents a new use of the supernatural and moves away from what she sees as the error of Walpole's work, which is the machinery is so violent that it destroys the effects it's intended to excite. And we have a contemporary witness here, basically her saying that people are laughing at this book. It becomes too ridiculous. Instead, she focuses on the acceptable supernatural and brings it within the bounds of possibility, i.e., within the kind of theological frameworks of belief around the ghostly or the supernatural at the period. So she has some ghosts appearing, and she has ghosts specifically appearing in dreams. Now, again, I've talked about this elsewhere at much greater length, but we have this distinction, oh, it happened in a dream, so it isn't real. At this period, that's still not exactly what's going on. Some people might say that, but there's also sort of strong thread of theological discourse around dreams, which imagine them as spaces of spiritual communication where the dead can potentially talk to you. So, i.e., real ghosts can appear in dreams, and that's what we get in this novel. She also changes the tone of the Gothic by moving away from that excess and also from the humour, the satire, and the excess of Walpole's Castle of Otranto. And it's this kind of more decorous Gothic which really lays the path for the popularity of the Gothic, particularly in the early 1790s, before we get something like Matthew Lewis's The Monk taking us again in another new direction. Another really interesting text in the history of the development of the Gothic is The Recess from 1785 by Sophia Lee, which is essentially an alt history novel that asks the question, or what if Mary, Queen of Scots, had twin daughters called Matilda and Eleanor? It's an imaginative history, but it draws on the real history of the period, including political and international events, and also figures like Elizabeth I is a character, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Essex. So it's drawing on real history. And it was critiqued at the time for that mix of fiction and history, but obviously this is a mode that will become incredibly popular later and also significantly predates Walter Scott. Something that it does differently to the earlier Gothic novels is it updates the period in which it's set. So here we're in the early modern period, and this is something which will become a feature of later Gothic novels. So we often associate the Gothic with the medieval, but in the 1790s, we have a real mix with books set from the medieval period up into the early modern and even set in the contemporary period in the 18th century. It also offers an interesting new direction. So previously in The Castle of Otranto, for example, or in Clara Reeves' novel, William Hutchinson's novels, there's a focus on male protagonists and male characters. Whereas here we have a woman-focused history, focusing on these two sisters, but also on Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth I. And it's not just women being victimized, although there's a lot of being victimized in it, but there's not just women being victimized and thinking about or engaged in romantic relationships. This also covers war, court intrigue, travel and dangers in Europe, Ireland, the West Indies, focuses extensively on politics and more as well. So there is some debate about whether this can really be called a Gothic novel, or it's more a sentimental novel or a historical novel with Gothic elements. There are certainly Gothic elements, including that titular recess, which is the underground space in which the two girls are brought up and which is later infested with that Gothic staple banditti. We've also got secret histories, so the girls aren't aware of their identity for most of the kind of first half of the novel. They don't realize that they're the daughters of Mary, Queen of Scots. And there's also plenty of betrayal and murder throughout. So there are lots of Gothic motifs, but whether we view this book as Gothic or not, it's an important sort of point in the development of where the Gothic will go. Because, as we'll see in the popularising of the Gothic, this kind of female-focused history, this updating to a later time period, become key features of a lot of popular Gothic novels. She also does something really interesting with the narrative style, and it's quite experimental. It's an epistolary novel, although it's not like letter, 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 letter. It's a couple of really long letters, where we get the perspective from the two sisters who offer different readings of the same events and the same people. They're both critical, for example, of each other's lovers, quite extensively critical. So it really destabilizes us as readers who we're able to trust. And we're left not really being able to trust anyone or anything within the world of the novel. And that kind of radical destabilization will become a feature of, well, significantly later Gothic developments as well. Now, I've talked here about two features in the early development of the Gothic, but it's worth thinking about the way women were pivotal in the development of the Gothic in its later stages as well. By the 1819 publication of 1818, I can remember, of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you're basically seeing the early Gothic dying off a little bit, losing popularity. But this is when we start to get these massive evolutions of the Gothic being taken in lots of different ways towards the ghost story, towards kind of Gothic romantic stylings of a Bronte, towards the kind of detective novel as well. But Mary Shelley is really standing on that frontier and forging some new paths for the Gothic while she's doing it. So she's on the Gothic and romantic border, drawing from the Gothic novel, but also from romantic concerns, particularly of second generation poets, thinking about liberty and politics in ways that echo the debates of, for example, Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, or interact with them critically. She's also sometimes credited as being one of the first authors of the weird, so moving away from sort of standard supernatural manifestations and exploring new boundaries of the supernatural and of the anti-natural. Of course, she's also a key figure in that blending of science fiction and the Gothic, and particularly that kind of emphasis on the medical Gothic, engaging with contemporary science and medical science specifically in her creation of this pieced together corpse. Just as a quick aside, by the way, guys, I quite often hear people say, oh, Mary Shelley wrote the first sci-fi novel. No, she did not. You can be a strict sort of genre delineator and look really at the kind of the official starts of a unified genre in the later 19th century with the work of Jules Verne, for example. But we can trace elements of science fiction much, much earlier as well. So in 1657, you have Cyrano de Bergerac's The Comical History of the States and Empires of the Moon, which includes a rocket journey into space. You have the utopian description of a new world called The Blazing World by Margaret Cavendish in 1666. You have the third book of Gulliver's Travels, which includes a world full of mathematical and then scientific experimentation, all of which significantly predate Frankenstein. But Mary Shelley is key in that combination of science fiction and the Gothic, and finding new paths for the investigation of questions like what is monstrosity? What are the dangers of science? I also want to mention that, we shouldn't stop with Frankenstein when we're thinking about Mary Shelley, her innovation or her impact on the genre. She also works on the borders of quite a lot of newly developing genres. So, for example, in The Last Man, it's a pandemic narrative, which is an apocalyptic narrative at the same time, where only one man is left alive. We've also got something like The Transformation, where you have people doing body swapping, so it paves the way for later texts like Jekyll and Hyde. And she also explores immortality and its perils in a way very familiar from modern vampire narratives, in a work like The Mortal Immortal, where the hero or protagonist, Windsor, accidentally drinks the immortal elixir of life. So we've got women developing the Gothic, but also being absolutely instrumental in popularising the Gothic. Now, nobody will be surprised that I'm about to talk about Anne Radcliffe, but I also want to know other incredibly popular writers of the time. So I'll be looking at Regina Maria Roche and also Mary Robinson, because it's easy for us in the modern day to kind of get real blinkers on about what we think is the Gothic, because we're only looking at a short selection of writers based on who has been kind of rescued by criticism, rather than looking at who was incredibly popular at the time. And I would be surprised if any people or many people have read either of these two novels, The Children of the Abbey or Vancenza, but they give us a really interesting insight into what was being read and what was popular in the 1790s. But first, let's go to Anne Radcliffe. And as Joan Passy says, Anne Radcliffe is really, really a central figure, an important figure in the early Gothic. I wouldn't go quite so far as this, but it's, Radcliffe's influence is indisputable. So Passy argues there is no Gothic without Anne Radcliffe, and Radcliffe is so central to the Gothic that Radcliffean Gothic is almost a tautology. As I say, I wouldn't go quite that far. I'd recognise the work of other Gothicists that predate her, for example, and produce fairly similar styles of novel, but she's the name that gets picked out. She's the one who is chosen as an example by both her contemporaries and by modern critics as a writer whose work is potentially uniquely valuable, or at least defendable. So we can have a look at one of her contemporaries here to see, well, what is it about Radcliffe's novels, which were so popular and which were picked out as being so special and so valuable. So Walter Scott says that Mrs. Radcliffe has a title be considered as the first poetess of romantic fiction. So there's this praise of her style of writing. There's an association of her writing with poetry. Now, that includes her not particularly great poetic insets, but it's more about her prose styling. So he's saying she writes prose like a poet, in other words. And this association with poetry gives her writing a cultural cachet, which is also supported by her extensive landscape depiction, which comes in for praise by most of her contemporaries, although not always without some kind of caveat, as we'll see later. But Walter Scott suggests that, the key thing that really made her novels so popular and made them the kind of thing that people would discuss with families, that they would tear the books from each other's hands, suggests that it's her use of suspense, essentially. He says that the public were chiefly aroused, or rather fascinated, by the wonderful conduct of a story in which the author so successfully called out the feelings of mystery and of awe, while chapter after chapter, incident after incident, maintained a thrilling attraction of awakened curiosity and suspended interest. Now, immediately our minds might jump to the supernatural explained, which is often associated with Radcliffe. It's not in all of her books, and it's not the only kind of supernatural that appears in her books, but it is a popular device that she uses, where something that's potentially supernatural like A Cry in the Night, gets explained with a natural explanation. And she often kind of separates that explanation from the phenomena by literally hundreds of pages, allowing for this continual build of tension and suspense. But it's not only with the supernatural that she does this, she also does this with mysteries like the famous Black Veil in Udolpho, which isn't an example of the supernatural explained. There's nothing supernatural about it. She never supposes that there is anything supernatural about it. But it's a mystery, and it seems to point to murder, maybe usurpation, terrible secrets, and violence, historical violence. It's revealed that that's not really the case, but she keeps that suspense going for, it's like 400 pages or something ridiculous. So this is what he's suggesting is what makes these novels so popular, what draws people to them. And this kind of style of writing does massively help to popularize the Gothic. Now, Radcliffe, for all of her impact, didn't write many novels. She only wrote 6, only 5 of which were published before her death. The last, the posthumous works in 1826, which included Gaston de Bondeville and St. Albans Abbey, wasn't published in her lifetime. The first and last books are somewhat outliers. They're both set in the medieval period with male protagonists. The idea of the Radcliffean Gothic comes from the 4 central novels: the Sicilian Romance, the Romance of the Forest, the Mysteries of Udolpho, and the Italian. Also in 1795, she writes some journals, giving herself some extra credentials in landscape depiction. But basically, what you have is people drawing key features from these novels, particularly after Romance of the Forest, which is when her popularity really soars. And associating these features with the Radcliffean Gothic, but also repeating and using these features. So this isn't necessarily something that Radcliffe has done for the first time, but she is popularizing these devices and combining them in such a way that it's a very distinctive style of writing. So what are some of these common features that then become staples of the Gothic, or perhaps already are? Well, she focuses on a female protagonist, a heroine in peril, usually running around Europe for some reason. Her heroes are noble, usually full of sensibility and sentiment, but generally ineffective. So they're not really riding bon traiter to the rescue. And if they do, they usually get stabbed or shot almost immediately. So she also features villains who are usually much more attractive and or interesting than the supposed hero. They're magnetic, but they're also tyrants, usually drawn from the aristocracy or the clergy. She includes a focus on religious institutions fairly consistently, either as places of entrapment or as places of refuge, or both. She also includes ruins as a central kind of focus, ruins of abbeys, of castles, of manors, and of course that sublime landscape depiction. There's also the use of the supernatural explained, although there are examples of the real supernatural in her work, and sometimes she leaves her examples ambiguous. And she also keeps the superstitious servant from earlier manifestations of the Gothic, like the Castle of Otranto, but she gives servants often a bit more dignity as well, and they become principal actors in a lot of her works, offering a counter narrative often to the sort of official noble narrative at the forefront of the book. Importantly, in this kind of style of the Gothic, we get happy endings. So everybody gets married, everything ends up fine. So this is the sort of impression that people have not only of Radcliffe, but also of women writing the Gothic more broadly in this period. Now, as I've mentioned, it's not true for every Radcliffe novel. Is it true for any of them? Sort of. It kind of distorts our understandings of the novel a little bit if we think that that's all the novels are. But does this apply to other people? Well, some of it, yes. But if we look at the other popular writers of the period, we're seeing them writing things that don't submit to that formula exactly and that offer slightly different versions of the Gothic. So Regina Maria Roche was an Irish writer, and her most famous novels were Claremont and The Children of the Abbey, both Gothic works. The Radcliffean influence is seen most clearly in Claremont. And so I'm going to talk today more about The Children of the Abbey, which was incredibly popular. Although it wasn't really mentioned by reviewers in 1796, The Children of the Abbey had gone through 11 editions by 1832 and remained in print for the whole of the 19th century. So this was, at the time, as popular, if not more popular than The Mysteries of Udolpho, and retained its popularity for up to a century. but then kind of fell into not disrepute, but just sort of out of fashion, and hasn't really been the focus of much sustained critical intervention, although there are some critics that have worked on it in really interesting ways. It's more of a sentimental romance with Gothic elements than a pure Gothic novel, whatever that might mean. But it offers us a different mode of what was popular with the Gothic. First of all, it's set in England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. It gives us a sort of trip around these different countries, looking at the politics, society, and religion of each of them. And it's set in the 18th century, so basically in the modern day. It focuses on two siblings in peril, so it has intertwining and overlapping central stories. Amanda and Oscar, who have been disinherited in part by a forged will and a stolen inheritance. Although this doesn't form the kind of focus of much of the story. As other critics have mentioned, Regina Maria Rush often focuses more on the sentimental and on the relationships and on the Gothic mysteries that might exist at the bottom of the text. So romance in peril is a key theme here in the relationships of different central characters. So there's Amanda and Lord Cherbury, who are beset consistently by misunderstandings. If you've read The Mysteries of Udolpho and thought you hated Valancourt, let me introduce you to Lord Cherbury, who spends all of the time thinking Amanda's cheating on him or isn't good enough for him, when she's actually being persecuted by the pursuit, including kidnapping of Colonel Belgrave, who Lord Cherbury thinks she's in love with and doesn't defend or help her because he's too busy going, "Oh, you don't love me." To the extent that she ends up kind of wandering impoverished in London. There's also a kind of secondary narrative about Oscar and his lady love, Adela Honeywood, who has been sort of forced into an unequal marriage with the villainous Colonel Belgrave. So he has to die for everything to work out well. But the novel is really kind of focused around these different relationships. Another interesting focus of this text that a number of critics have talked about is that it provides a largely positive depiction of Catholicism. It's part of an interesting strain of particularly Irish Gothic, which navigates the Catholic in more nuanced ways than we're perhaps used to from writers like Matthew Lewis in The Monk. The other novel that I want to mention as popularising the Gothic in particular ways is Mary Robinson's Vancenza, or The Dangers of Credulity, from 1792. So Mary Robinson was famous in her own right before becoming a writer. She was famous as an actress and also as a mistress to the Prince Regent, known for her beauty as well, and often referred to as Perdita. So she was essentially writing as a celebrity author when she wrote her first novel. It sold out almost instantly, perhaps apocryphally. It sold out by lunchtime of the first day and quickly went into a number of other editions. In the third edition, which you can find easy access to online, she mentions these quick sales, saying that the sales of 2 editions of Vancenza within 1 month of its publication is too unequivocal of a proof of protection or sort of support to allow me a silent gratification. So she dedicates the preface of the third edition, somewhat unusually, to the public, thanking them for buying the book, essentially. Again, this offers some overlap with models of the Gothic that we're already familiar with. We've got heroines in love troubles. There's an incredible amount of nature depiction, and it really makes you appreciate how good Radcliffe is at it to read this, if I'm honest. It focuses on the story of Elvira and her sort of quasi-sister, but it's mostly about Elvira and her thwarted love for Almanza and her persecution by the Duke del Vero. Eventually, everything ends up okay. She's explained everything with Almanza. It's all going to go well, but spoiler alert, a family secret gets in the way because she's been raised as an orphan, not really knowing who her parents were. In the end, she has a brass key that unlocks a box that reveals a letter that tells her about her past. And it turns out that she's the niece of the man who fostered her, the illegitimate child of his sister, and, dun dun dun, the father of Almanza. So she's been on the cusp of an incestuous marriage with her own brother. The shock of that is enough to kill her basically straight off. She dies the same night as she discovers this. So there's no happy ending in Mary Robinson's novel, and we'll find this to be a fairly continual feature of many of her works as well. What we also find in Mary Robinson, though, is a proto-feminism that paves the way for the more kind of overtly feminist Gothic stylings of somebody like Mary Wollstonecraft. But her work frequently challenges women's place in the world. So a couple of examples here. You have Elvira commenting on her inability to support herself. So often did she blame the mistaken tenderness with which she had been educated and which had circumscribed the line of her accomplishments to the elegant rather than the useful. So Mary Robinson is engaging with that early feminist or proto-feminist critique of women's education or lack of education towards accomplishment rather than actual knowledge or sort of any ability to engage in their own support. And we have Elvira as well focusing on the kind of plight of a woman without the ability to support herself and dedicating herself to blessed independence at one point. We also have commentaries on things like honor, reputation, society and its effect on women, women's precarious position in marriage and society, often in quite long screeds which discuss these issues overtly. So Mary Robinson's novel wasn't particularly well written, and it doesn't necessarily have a massive impact on the Gothic, although it is a sort of minor strain of the Gothic, this more overtly feminist writing. But it does demonstrate what people were reading and what people were finding engaging and how the Gothic was being consumed and popularized. I'll just finish this section with a little quote from Van Senza so that you can get an idea of the kind of writing. So Almanza and Elvira are introduced when he's been wounded by hunting a boar, and she rips the veil from her face and binds his arm with it. Because what better material than gauze than sort of flighty veil gauze to stem an arterial bleed. Anyway, the veil which Elvira had bound about his wound and which was sufficiently ample to encircle the arm in a variety of folds had effectually stopped the effusion of blood. The magic bandage was so powerfully impregnated with the most exquisite odors that the returning sense, seizing upon their vivifying properties in a few minutes, to experience the delight of perfect restoration. So if you want to read it, it is available online, but it's heavy weather, heavy weather. So talked about these kind of massively popular novels and writers. Now I want to think a little bit more about women writing the Gothic, because women were arguably the primary producers of the Gothic, particularly the Gothic novel, in that early period. As Anna Nee Aitken writes in 1810, it may be safely affirmed that we have more good writers in this work, i.e. the novel, living at the present time than at any period since the days of Richardson and Fielding in the mid-18th century. It will not be said that either taste or morals have been losers by their taking the pen in hand. So she's speaking to the volume in which women are taking the pen and producing the Gothic, not only in novels, though, but in poetry, in short fiction, on the stage. So I'm going to briefly introduce you to a couple of different women writers here: Charlotte Dacre, Sarah Wilkinson, Lucy Watkins, Anne Bannerman, Joanna Baillie. And we're also going to return to Mary Robinson quickly as well. Because Mary Robinson wasn't only a novelist, she was also a poet, alongside Anne Bannerman and Charlotte Dacre, all of whom published collections either completely Gothic or with a number of Gothic poems in them, and are contributors to the fashion for Gothic poetry. So Mary Robinson's sort of famous collection of poems is the Lyrical Tales, which engages critically as a response to the Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in ways that, as Hogel notes, are often bound up with and filtered through the Gothic. So she sort of contests some of the framing of the Lyrical Ballads, particularly its depiction of kind of worthy peasants struggling with life, but, ennobled by their toil. Instead, she focuses on injustice and abuse of power. She undercuts the ballad's attempt at cultural homogeneity by employing a wider profusion of stanzaic and sonic patterns and refusing a kind of this is what poetry is, or this is what real life is, or value is, or the working classes model that does extend to some extent into the lyrical ballads. She also focuses extensively on the trauma of women and on the gross realities of 1790s Britain for those in marginalized or deprived groups, including the working class, all of it, and women. You can also see in the work potentially responses to individual poems directly. So The Haunted Beach has often been sort of seen as a response to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Something that's interesting in terms of the depiction of women in these poems is that romantic love is not the solution. Most of these, like her novel, end fairly unhappily. And romantic love, according to Lab, in its very failure, figures and emblematizes its own emptiness. Love is not going to save you, while heroines become the focus. So in fact, the failure of love allows for heroines to take on a different role within the poetry, and to become the focus rather than this kind of, well, if you love somebody, it'll turn out okay, I guess. So this kind of recasting of women or exploration of different roles for women is going to be a consistent feature of these three women's poetry. Charlotte Dacre's poetry is really based in Gothic horrors. So she's not confined to that, valued terror, but she dives into all the possible excesses. A couple of examples of her poems include The Skeleton Priest, which includes an unwise marriage. You'd think if your priest was a skeleton that you'd probably be like, wait, I think something's wrong. And The Murderer, which explores the psyche and experiences of a murderer. She also includes a variety of other tropes in her poems, most of which are collected in Hours of Solitude, volumes 1 and 2. And the Gothic tropes include demon lovers, apparitions, spectres, supernatural warnings, heroines in peril, of course, skeletons, ruins, storm-ridden, and wintry landscapes. Again, her heroines are slightly different than the heroines of her novels, which you might be more familiar with, where they're usually villainesses. But the heroines in her poems are mostly romantic maidens who experience some sort of grave misfortune due to love. But that's not sort of the end of the story. Dacre in her novels and in her poetry is always interested in exploring female experience and female desire. And so the women in Dacre's poems expose their own strong will regarding the way they wish to experience love and desire, even if this conduct can prove to be calamitous and fatal, which it usually does. These poems, much like many of Mary Robinson's, are sort of have the failure or absence of hope as a really key theme. So this is women writing a very kind of not dreary, but dark form of the Gothic. Now, of course, Charlotte Dacre is also a novelist as well as a poet, and her novels are associated with explicit horror, often kind of sexual deviance. So novels like The Nuns of St. Omer, Nun of St. Omer, or The Floyer. This picture here is from an adaptation of her novel The Floyer, so The Demon Lover. I use it because it's got a much better picture than anything else to do with The Floyer. But it's a book where you have a sort of a similar narrative to The Monk, in that you've got a narrative of demonic temptation, which leads our protagonist, Victoria, down a pathway of murder, rape, kidnap, and all sorts of other crimes, eventually resulting in her being tossed off a mountaintop, as you do. But it relies on the overt supernatural, it relies on horror, and it has that negative ending as well. So she's offering a very different model of the Gothic to somebody like Anne Radcliffe. Now, Anne Bannerman's poetry has kind of seen a resurgence in critical interest in the last couple of years. She wasn't very prolific as well. She released 2 collections of poetry in 1800 and 1802, but had to stop publishing due to financial constraints and needing to work as a governess for the rest of her life. In Tales of Superstition and Chivalry, she points back towards older ballad traditions, medieval influence, and the possibilities of terror and the supernatural. In a poetic preface to the volume, she tells us about her inspirations. Yet in their cabined dark recesses dwells the long spirit of forgotten times, whose voice prophetic reached to distant climes and ruled the nation from his witched cell. That voice is hushed, but still in fancy's ear its first unmeasured melodies resound, blending with terrors wild and legends drear, the charmed minstrelsy of mystic sound that roused, embodied to the eye of fear, the unearthly habitants of fairy ground. So she draws out the importance of the supernatural, the medieval, and also the unexplained. Contemporaries were a little bit nonplussed by some of her poetry, pointing towards its, and I'm using a quoted word here, its nebulous properties, where you're not really sure perhaps what's happened, what the supernatural entity is, why it's happening. But this poetry, unlike some of the others that we've looked at, relies on the interpretive and imaginative effort of the reader to engage with it. And if I was to recommend one of these 3 poets, it would be Anne Bannerman. She also takes a different approach to depicting women. And in poems like The Dark Lady, where you have this mysterious, unexplained, haunting figure, she represents women who cannot be exterminated, who keep coming back from the dead to avenge themselves on their oppressors. And she presents the woman as a vampiric, powerful, angry, vengeful force of nature, uncontrolled and uncontrollable by any religious or political system. Exciting stuff. So from poetry, I want to move on to the chapbook. These were cheaper, shorter publications open to a much broader audience, from the working class to the lower middle class, anybody who could read, and these were more affordable, particularly if you were borrowing them from a lending library as well, perhaps. But they would cost, sometimes referred to as shilling shockers, but They could be cheaper as well. And I'm going to talk about two writers of the chapbook, Sarah Wilkinson and Lucy Watkins. What we're seeing with these writers of chapbooks is we're not seeing people connected to that discourse of genius who are inspired to write, but rather people who are writing for a living, who are writing quite often massive volumes for relatively cheap pay, but are the backbone of this kind of short form Gothic that really took off in the early 19th century. So Sarah Wilkinson is the most prolific author to use her own name that we know of. And she wrote over 63 Gothic chapbooks. We can't be certain of the exact number because chapbooks are fairly ephemeral. We don't necessarily have them all. She worked with 25 different publishers. So she's a canny businesswoman, essentially. And she also had a 22-year career where her writing supported her through various vicissitudes, through lengthy illnesses, and also through raising her daughter alone, possibly her illegitimate daughter. She also had some other careers. So she worked as an educator, she worked as a bookseller, but it was to writing which she consistently returned to try and support herself. Now, to think of the impact of Wilkinson on the chapbook market, we can do some comparisons, and these figures are from Franz Potter. So chapbooks could be original works, but were also often adaptations of existing popular works like The Monk or The Mysteries of Udolpho. Between 1797 and 1830, there were 119 adaptations of popular work, and at least 24, that would be 20% of them, were Wilkinson. So she is a massive figure in the chapbook world. As well as adaptations, she wrote original works and adaptations and translations of novels and dramas. She also, as I've mentioned, collaborated with a lot of publishers, but particularly with female publishers as well, with relationships with Anne Lemoine, Susan Bailey, and Dean and Munday, which extended into sort of regular contributions. She not only worked as a house writer, but contributed to things like the Ladies' Monthly magazine, monthly museum magazine, where she was paid a half guinea at first and then a guinea. She struggled with money extensively, particularly towards the end of her life, where she was severely ill. And we also see Dean and Munday, for example, supporting her applications to the Royal Literary Fund for money, some of which sometimes she got it, sometimes she didn't. So Sarah Wilkinson's a really interesting insight into what life was like for women working as a job in this period, women who were just on the cusp of the poverty line, essentially, and to the support systems that did or did not exist for such writers. So I mentioned the RLF, but we have the Literary Fund set up in 1790 and going through to 1830, to which struggling writers could apply. But it was quite difficult to get money from them, and you never got much, because the criteria for application were you had to demonstrate genius, talent, or learning sort of, your craft, essentially, literary industry, which wasn't a problem for Sarah Wilkinson, but also obvious utility. And this could be a problem for Gothic writers, depending on the critiques that had been raised against them, or the particular conception of the Gothic by those awarding the money. Sarah Wilkinson was able to apply for funding, often referencing her children's writing more than her Gothic novels or her Gothic chapbooks. But what was she actually writing in these books? Well, Heuvel has noted that Wilkinson is an interesting case study of a female entrepreneur that challenges, if we haven't already challenged it enough, the idea of a sort of single female Gothic where all women writers are writing the same way. Heuvel suggests that Wilkinson made authorial decisions based on a purely market-driven aesthetic. Now, I don't entirely agree with this. She was certainly influenced by the market, but we do see a distinctive voice, I would say, across a number of her works. But Heuvel notes that she's writing works that crossed over the gender divide. So she's using horror and terror, and not kind of conforming to any separation of those two things. And she's attempted to appeal to the largest possible readership with no regard to her own gender as the author. We do have her own words, so Sarah Wilkinson's own words on her monetary kind of rationale for what she's writing. So in the preface to The Spectre of Landmere, she says, authors are proverbially poor, and therefore under the necessity of racking their wits for a bare subsistence. Perhaps this is my case, and knowing how eager the fair sex are for something new and romantic, I determined on an attempt to please my fair sisterhood, hoping to profit myself thereby. If the following volume tends to that effect, I shall be gratified. But if they meet with a rapid sale and fill my pockets, I shall be elated. I really love this quote. It points to the fact that she's writing for what she perceives to be a female readership, which is interesting in and of itself. It points to her monetary kind of impetus, but but also that she is writing for an audience, that she's trying to produce works for them. Now, although Heubler says she's using horror and terror, there's still a restraint to a lot of Sarah Wilkinson's writing as she's trying to write acceptably for this audience. But what are those distinctive features of Sarah Wilkinson's writing that I mentioned? Well, there's often a class consciousness, I think, to her work that offers an interesting counterbalance to the noble heroes and heroines of much of early Gothic literature. So an example would be Albert of Wendendorf or The Midnight Embrace. And if you follow the Scare a Day challenge at Romancing the Gothic, we did read this last year, I think, published 1812, and it focuses on Albert, who's, your standard lord of an ancient and stately castle, a young nobleman of elegant person and fascinating manners, but his heart was prone to deceit. And there's two romantic interests for him. There's Josephine, the poor cottager who he seduces and lies to, and Grimelda, the haughty bride. And basically, after Grimelda marries him, she says, look, I'm not having sex with you until you get rid of Josephine. I don't just want you to dump her, I want you to kill her. And he's like, okay. So he goes off, poisons her, and says, oh, I'll see you tomorrow at midnight, obviously never intending to do so because he's expecting her to be dead. And she does, in fact, die. But she keeps the appointment and gets her revenge. So she appears the following night, and with these words, Josephine wound her arms around his trembling form. I'm come from the confines of the dead, said she, to make thee fulfill the parting promise. And she dragged him by a force he could not resist to her breast. She pressed her clammy lips to his and held him fast in her noisome, icy embrace. There's a little bit of grotesque in there as well. And there is a rampant supernaturalism, but also leavened with a moral didacticism. Another example of this kind of class consciousness is found in the Castle of Montalbino, where we get two narratives, the two noble sisters who are imprisoned, perhaps under threat, but we also get the story of a lower class woman called Hermina, whose tale goes significantly worse for her and offers an alternative perspective of the threat posed by wealthy men. It seems to have a conservative leaning at times, being suspicious of education, that she's got too educated, she got above herself, or suspicious of reading, but I don't think we should just read this with no nuance. Instead, I think Sarah Wilkinson is not against education or reading. In fact, that's the way she supported herself. But rather, she's making some sort of critique of how these books are imbibed, how they're experienced. So in the story, she says that the ladies at the seminary has accessed these books. They procured romances and novels, and for want of a person able to select them, they read indiscriminately the good and the bad, and unfortunately many that had a pernicious tendency. So she might just be, paying homage to this critique of Gothicism and separating herself from it. But I think there's also this sense of you have to be careful with what you read and what you believe from what you read, because she pokes fun at the Gothic tropes in her depiction of Hermina. Hermina sort of goes out on her own on an adventure, thinking that she'll be found and fallen in love with, but no invitations to visit the neighboring gentry, no admirers, no young men of fortune ready to sacrifice friends and family to cast themselves at her feet. So the Gothic tropes are poked fun at, but not just to poke fun at the Gothic, but to suggest that there is a class difference, that those tropes are never going to apply to you if you're working class, that they are a danger in and of themselves, that it is a danger to forget who you are in and to the world, two with one O. And this isn't a sense of know your place, poor people. It's a sense of be careful, other poor people. Like, don't believe these myths and these stories. Read with intelligence in order to pass out what the world actually is for you and how dangerous it is for you. So she investigates in this story really the hardships of a woman trying to earn her own way in the world, something with which Sarah Wilkinson was eminently familiar. So another chapbook writer is Lucy Watkins, and here we really do get the supernatural and the horrid. These books are so much fun. Cavigni of Tuscany here, and Romano Castle, The Horrors of the Forest. She's also one of the kind of chapbook authors who used her name on the publications. The majority were anonymously published. And you have the excessive apparent supernatural in these. It always works out not to be the supernatural, but it's really testing the believability of the natural explanations, if we're honest. But what's particularly noticeable is the degree to which they lean into horror and the classic chapbook trope that doesn't really appear in Gothic novels of accidentally sticking your hand in a corpse's mouth as you're trying to explore a passageway or building. But it also includes kind of twisted multiple narratives with multiple kind of figures and various reveals where we're kind of misled multiple times. And she also leans into the form of the Gothic, where you have bandits, robbers, and murder as the key kind of components. Interestingly, as well, in Cavigni of Tuscany, a terrific romance, you also have a cross-dressing heroine who is playing the role of a violent and vicious robber chief. Well, she's been kidnapped, and that's the role that she has to take on because they don't realize she's a woman, or else it would go even worse. But she's kind of forced to join them and take on the role of the chief that they have murdered for being too vicious. They pick her because she's the weakest of the men, so that she can't threaten the rest of them. And then she uses this opportunity to punish the man who's been pursuing her and eventually find her real lover. It's a great novel, a great sort of chapbook. I do recommend reading it, but it also demonstrates the ways in which women were writing outside of our conceptions of what women were writing, and creating very unusual and active heroines. So women were also present on the stage as actresses and also as writing dramas. And the most famous of them and the most popular was Joanna Baillie, a Scottish author, who is both a playwright and a poet. So when her plays were the Play of the Passions were originally published, they were wrongly attributed first to male authors until people noted that there's quite a lot of female protagonists, possibly not the type of female protagonist that men would write. And also, they were attributed to Anne Radcliffe. There's a series of letters between kind of literary figures of the time saying, oh, it's Radcliffe's latest play, but they're not by Radcliffe, they're by Joanna Baillie. And she lays out sort of a project for a series of plays, saying that, this is what I think plays should focus on. I've been led to believe that an attempt to write a series of tragedies of simpler construction than the standard play, less embellished with poetical decorations, and less constrained by that lofty seriousness, which is so generally be considered as necessary for the support of tragic dignity, in which the chief object should be to delineate the progress of the higher passions of the human breast, each play exhibiting a particular passion that might not be unacceptable to the public. So in other words, a series of plays, each one of which focuses on a particular passion. And a number of these plays are comic, but a number of them are Gothic, including Aura, for example, and the most famous of them, De Montfort, which focuses on the passion of hatred, and De Montfort's spiral of hatred against a rival Rosenfeld. Interestingly, call back to Schimmelpenninck, Schimmelpenninck uses De Montfort as an example of the terrible, active sublime. And the plays were popular and were sort of widely discussed at the time, and also staged numerous times as well. And her dramatic writing had an impact on later Gothic stage plays and is mentioned as an impact by writers including, for example, Lord Byron. So she was influential and popular as a dramatist, and I do recommend reading De Montfort if you're interested in early Gothic drama. So moving on, I want to mention briefly publishing the Gothic, because women weren't only producing the Gothic through writing, they were also integral to the dissemination of the Gothic in different ways, particularly in the chapbook industry. So I've got 3 examples of publishers here. First is Anne Lemoine. Then we have got Dean and Munday, and we've got, Dean and Munday at one edge, and we've got Baillie in the middle as well. So we've got 3 different women, or Dean and Munday are 2 women working together, who were sort of intricately involved in the publishing of the Gothic. And I want to sort of briefly point to Anne Lemoine as a particularly key figure, because as Franz Potter notes, her reputation was primarily based on tremendous Gothic romances, and she published at least 99 of them, significantly higher than any other publisher. So she's publishing from between 1799 to 1812, and was often collaborating with other publishers and booksellers as well. But she's not only a key figure in producing these Gothic chapbooks, but also in innovating their production and their marketing. So all of these details are taken from Franz Potter's book, and I definitely recommend it if you're interested in the chapbook. on Gothic blue book, Gothic chapbooks, blue books, and shilling shockers. There's also a talk on the channel if you're interested by Franz Potter. But one of the ways she innovated in production and marketing was through the use of illustration. So rather than woodcuts and etching, she was the first to use aquatint frontispieces for the Gothic texts. So as Potter notes, this marked a shift not only in the production and manufacturing, but it also underscored the broader effort to market these tales to middle-class readers or to an upper class of reader. So she also sold collections of these tales, again aimed at a middle-class reader. So often what would happen with these chapbooks is they'd print loads of them, sell some of them, and then they'd collect these already printed tales together in volumes, often themed, and then resold on, bound at a higher price, made available to a slightly more upmarket audience. So her full-length collections of chapbooks such as Wild Roses or Cottage Tales, an interesting title for a very Gothic collection, English Knights Entertainment, and also the magazine she published, the Telltale magazine, facilitated the shift from individual to more significant collections of thematically analogous chapbooks. So really, we can see this as part of the history of short story anthologies as well, I would argue. Finally, having thought about all of these ways in which women were producing the Gothic, I want to end by thinking about women reading the Gothic. Now, women weren't the only consumers of the Gothic, but they were seen as a sort of key audience for the Gothic. And part of that was to do with the access to books and the changing reading and dissemination patterns that we're seeing in this period through particularly the circulating libraries, which were a key source for getting hold of Gothic texts, both books and pamphlets, and which made these Gothic texts more widely available, fostering a culture of kind of quick reading and also kind of reading or seeking continually new books, new sources of discussion for you and your friends. The first circulating library was in Edinburgh, yay to Scotland, in 1725 with Alan Ramsay's circulating library. By 1800, there were at least 26 in London alone and 1,000 in the UK. So they grew popular fairly rapidly, and they really changed the way that people were reading. The number of books in any one collection would vary. In London in the 1760s, it was typical to have about 5,000. By the 80s and 90s, 8,000. And the Minerva Press, which we'll talk about in a minute, had 20,000 books. Provincial libraries and small libraries in London would also have sort of smaller collections, so 400 to 3,000. And they would often also be hybrid, offering you books to borrow, medicine, hats, tobacco, and even, if you're very lucky, barbering. So different libraries would work differently, but there would usually be an annual or a quarterly fee. So approximately the price of two 3-volume books. This would be 2 guineas by 1800. Often, particularly these hybrid libraries would also lend books on a penny fee, so you would just pay for the specific book. There tended to be a lending limit, which would often be something like 2 books at any one time, and only one of them could be new. And you would get the books for a different amount of time based on how new it was. So new popular books that were like running off the shelves, you'd get for 2 to 6 days. So really having to speed read that. And older books would be a month. Now, you might be thinking, my God, I could never read The Mysteries of Udolpho in 2 days. Correct. Nobody could in sleep, I don't think. But what you have is the books being published in volumes. So you would take a volume out for 2 days. Still a bit of a challenge, but you could do it. And often you would go in and experience the library, but they would also have catalogues, making it available to people that couldn't necessarily get there in person as well. The effect of these circulating libraries was that books were more widely accessible, although they were still affecting predominantly, the middle class upwards from the lower middle class up. But there was more access to more books, which led to a change in reading habits with an emphasis on novelty and quantity of reading, really paving the way for the Gothic, churning out novels in the 1790s and the chapbook industry of the early 19th century. So really key press for this that was producing these books being read by these circulating libraries was the Minerva Press, which was also its own circulating library. The Minerva Press existed from 1773 to 1848 and was set up by William Lane and later taken over by Anthony King Newman after 1808. As mentioned, it was both a publisher and a circulating library, so it was producing some, at least, of its own stock. It also had franchises, which included provincial libraries, and so it could provide ready-made stock to its network of libraries across the country. They're famous for their advertising practices, both for their catalogues and also for their use of works published in books that they were publishing. So, you could pick up one book and learn about three more. They had a key influence on genre reading and publishing, particularly in relation to the Gothic and the way that people were reading the Gothic. They published over 800 new works, which is an immense amount for a publisher at that time. And they worked with both kind of irregular authors who would pitch them books, but also with a regular stable of authors, both major and minor, as we'll see in a second. They also, as well as original works, produced a lot of translations and adaptations. So you can see how they're sort of paving the way for the later chapbook industry. And then many Minerva novels were translated in their turn, showing these kind of international connections of the Gothic. So these are some of the Minerva novels that you may or may not have heard of or read. As I say, we've got massive big name writers. So Regina Maria Roche wrote the most popular of all the Minerva novels, apparently, and she published with them. You've got sort of translations or adaptations like The Necromancer or Tale of the Black Forest, one of the horrid novels mentioned in Northanger Abbey. Classics like The Animated Skeleton, which, a great read. And also a lot of books by a woman called Mrs. Meek, whose titles I absolutely love. And this is probably my favorite. There is a secret. Find it out. It's the kind of title that I write when I'm writing a book rather than a talk. Also, it's worth mentioning that women had, a role in disseminating books as booksellers. So here, for example, we have an earlier 18th century example, Isabella Tibby Tinkler, who was working out of Richmond. We also have people like Sarah Wilkinson running her own small library. So, and publishers like Dean and Munday working as booksellers, bookbinders, printers, publishers, and more. So women really taking part in this dissemination of reading as well. Quick trans history break. When I was looking up booksellers at this period, I came across a John de Verdian, who was born in 1744 and lived as a man from 1763 onwards, starting life in Leipzig, but moved to England after inquiry into his gender, who was a used bookseller and language teacher. I just thought that was an interesting little piece of trans history, which had been sort of misrecorded when I was looking up female booksellers. But if you want information, I've popped a link there and I'm happy to pop that in the chat later. And this is a sort of satiric illustration of John as he lived. So just an interesting little break there. In terms of how the Gothic was being read, we can get an insight from accounts like Jane Austen's in Northanger Abbey, where she talks about the mysteries of Udolpho. And we have the two friends at the time, Catherine and Isabella, sharing this love of Gothic novels and showing as well how they're sort of getting novels out of the circulating library, replacing them, getting another one, really devouring them one after another, and able to do so because of the circulating library. But we also see this kind of communal reading practice. Now, it would have been common to read together as families, but we're also seeing this as a form of sociability, the discussion of these novels. And here they're talking about, I won't read it out, but they're talking about the mystery of the black veil in the mysteries of Udolpho. Of course, Northanger Abbey is often seen as being a loving parody of the Gothic, but it's worth noting that Jane Austen isn't criticizing simply the reading of Gothic novels here, and we shouldn't see this as simply a critique. Instead, she allows the way that Gothic novels are read to be a sort of character test, the ultimate test of character being your taste in the Gothic. So the approved romantic figure, Henry Tilney, loves a bit of Radcliffe. He's reading the right kind of Gothic. And he also says quite, directly, the person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid. I've read all Mrs. Radcliffe's works, and most of them with great pleasure. The Mysteries of Udolpho, when I had once begun it, I could not lay down again. And I remember finishing it in 2 days, my hair standing on end the whole time. So maybe people could read it in 2 days. But you also have people reading the Gothic wrong as sort of key. And again, it's a male reader here. You have John Thorpe sort of pretending he's read the Gothic. Like, have you ever read Udolpho? Oh, God, no. No, I've not read Udolpho. And then later saying, oh, yeah, Mrs. Radcliffe's novels are worth reading. There's some fun and nature in them with Catherine So brilliant. But Udolpho was written by Mrs. Radcliffe. So he clearly is kind of more fashionably engaged with reading the Gothic. But the novel that he loves is The Monk. And this is a telling character flaw in this novel. He likes to read Tom Jones and The Monk, both of which are very sexy, salacious books. So it's a Gothic red flag. But how about the reading of the women in the novel? Well, we know it leads them astray, but it is also something that is a form of enjoyment. And it also does warn Catherine about some of the less positive realities of the world. But if we want to look at real women reading the Gothic, we can look at contemporary journals and letters and see how they're engaging with it. Hester Lynch Thrale Piozzi is writing in her journal here, and it's a really interesting sort of insight into the ways in which the Gothic was being perceived, talked about, and understood. She's relating back to Vathek by William Beckford, and she's giving this kind of quite gossipy summary of what she thinks it's about. So William Beckford was disgraced out of society for his affair with a teenager, essentially a teenage boy. And he was called by Byron the great apostle of pederasty. So this is the favorite propensity that Hester Lynch Thrale Piozzi is talking about. She says, I've been reading Vathek, and 'tis a mad book to be sure, and written by a mad author. Yet there is a sublimity about it, particularly towards the conclusion. Mr. Beckford's favourite propensity is all along visible, I think, particularly in the luscious descriptions given of Gulkenraus, but his quarantine seems to be performed, after his exile, and I'm told he has returned quietly to Fonthill. When we were at Milan, Mr. Bisset brought over the news how he was hooted from society by my Lord Loughborough, who threatened corporal or legal punishment for Mr. Beckford's violation of young Courtney, brother to Lady Loughborough. At Luçon, no Englishman would exchange a word with the creature, and charming Dr. Fisher's charitable heart pitied his wretched exclusion from the world. But since Courtney came to his estate and title, and I suppose treated the whole business as a joke or common occurrence, all is over. And I hear nothing said of Mr. Beckford but as an author. What a world it is. So you're getting this kind of gossipy discussion of the book, but also seeing how people are engaging with some of the more salacious end of the Gothic as well. And this kind of appeal of these books, perhaps in this case, not in a letter, but secretly hidden away in her journal, her enjoyment of this scandalous read. You also get Gothic judgment and criticism going on in the confines of letters and discussions between women and men. Anna Seward is one of the people who is involved in that long letter train, speculating about the authorship of the Passion plays. But here she talks about the mysteries of Udolpho and gives this kind of criticism of the Gothic, which, as we've already seen, creates out of Mrs. Radcliffe the exception. Because her Mysteries of Udolpho is a much superior work to her Romance of the Forest. The first volume of that is fine, the rest heavy and uninteresting and contains very effective writing. But Udolpho contains enough to awaken an interest attention in every volume. I was, however, frequently wearied in the perusal, since, though her powers of scenic description are very considerable, she wants judgment to be aware that the incessant and laboured exertion of these powers counteracts their influence, weakening it by degrees till attention sinks in languid safety. So she's creating Radcliffe as a distinction, as a book that's perhaps worthy of reading, but also is open to her critique. And I am glad to see somebody else critiquing the lengthy nature depictions of this period. Finally, I want to leave on a note of the positive ways in which women might be engaging with the Gothic and what it offered to the female reader. And I'm jumping forward in time here to Charlotte Bronte's novel Shirley, which is set back in an earlier period. But it has one of the protagonists talking about what the Gothic novel, The Italian, by Mrs. Radcliffe, by Anne Radcliffe, offers to the reader. So it says, Caroline had tact and fine instinct, talking to Rose York. She felt that Rose York was a peculiar child, one of the unique, and she knew how to treat her. Approaching quietly, she knelt on the carpet at her side and looked over her little shoulder at her book. It was a romance of Mrs. Radcliffe's, The Italian. Caroline read on with her, making no remark, and presently Rose showed her the attention of asking, ere she turned a leaf, Are you ready? Caroline only nodded. Do you like it? Inquired Rose ere long. Long since, when I read it as a child, I was wonderfully taken with it. Why? It seemed to open with such promise, such foreboding of a most strange tale to be unfolded. And in reading it, you feel as if you were far away from England, really in Italy, under another sort of sky, that blue sky of the south which travellers describe. You're sensible of that, Rose. It makes me long to travel, Miss Helston. Do you have a number of interesting features here? The idea of the Gothic being available and read by children, first of all, but you also get this sense of engagement with the Gothic as a genre which is opening up against the limitations of female life in the period. So you get the Gothic as a passport to travel, as a passport to emotions beyond the daily range of the rational and the mundane and the domestic. And it gives this idea of the positive power of the Gothic and some sense of its popularity or the reasons why it was popular with female readers of the time. So I'm open to any questions, guys. A little bit of a list of references there. And let's see what you have been chatting about.